Hey guys, welcome back to Andy's Dinosaur Reviews, and today we are going to do something that we don't do too often, and that is review an older figure. Most of the time on the channel nowadays it seems like I'm only reviewing newer stuff. However, I do love going back and checking out older releases, and one figure that is absolutely as monumental in my life as far as getting me into collecting dinosaurs, this one here. This figure is one of the single most monumental figures in my collecting obsession, because when I was a child, and I'm talking pretty young because obviously this figure was actually released in 1993, so I would imagine it's probably around that time that I had seen this. I was with my father at a shop while we were camping in this one area. It's about an hour away from me, and he had taken me over to a town that was nearby. He took me into a shop, and I remember seeing this figure there, and I spent years trying to figure out what this figure was when I was younger. At the time, we just didn't have enough money to purchase one, so I unfortunately did not get the pleasure of adding it to my collection, or just my toy collection, I guess, at that point, because I wasn't technically collecting dinosaurs. But I spent so long trying to figure out what the figure was, and it wasn't until years later that I finally found out what it was. It was obviously the Safari LTD Velociraptor, and it was a figure that I just was so in love with at the time, and I always desperately wanted to own one of. And again, now I have the pleasure of owning tons of them because it's probably one of the most popular figures from Safari LTD to acquire in different lots and stuff. But I really wanted to dedicate an entire review to this figure because I just feel like it deserves it, since it has done so much for me as far as getting me into collecting dinosaurs. It was one of the... Actually, it was probably the very first Safari LTD figure that I had ever seen. But as you can see, we actually have it here in the packaging. And this isn't something that you get to see too often, is the original packaging for this release. And you can see in the window area, we've got the Velociraptor. Obviously, it states Velociraptor on the front of the box, but we have very cool artwork back there in the background also showing off the Velociraptor, which is really neat. And if we turn the box around, first of all, there's a shot on the side there of the artwork again. Same deal on the opposing side. But if you take a look at the back of the box, you again have the artwork that you see on the inside there with the Velociraptor attempting to take down a Protoceratops. You also have all sorts of information on the species and even more information over here. And again, you don't often see Safari LTD figures in boxes. I know the Dinosaurs of China figures that had come out around the same time as this often included boxes, but it was a different style, a different look for those. But definitely really cool to again see a figure like this again in a box. Safari LTD really put their all into the presentation of this one. And look at the old school Safari LTD logo. But what is cool about this is, again, the figure was fantastic for its time. Of course, it's not the most accurate interpretation of a Velociraptor currently, but it obviously spawned a few different versions afterwards. First of all, these are just babies. They're not technically anything to do with this. I think they were little tube figures, but you could very clearly see that there's a bit of a resemblance. So I did want to just bring these guys in just to quickly show them off to you guys and show that there are kind of babies for these, but I don't know if you would technically, I guess, consider them related to these figures. But on top of the version we had just seen, again, you can see that there was a brown version released after the release of this Velociraptor, and there was also a glow-in-the-dark version, and that is really cool. Both of these are actually kind of hard to find, and definitely a task to get a hold of. If you get lucky, you might be able to score one at some point for fairly cheap, but they are pretty hard to find overall. And actually, what's cool is with the brown one, you can purchase that right now on Dejankins.com, and it's only like $8, which is a crazy cheap price for that. I did want to give a plug to Dejankins, always having awesome old stock and stuff like that you can pick stuff up and, again, add it to your collection that way, because Dejankins is definitely a great place to buy dinos from. But here we have the Velociraptor now fresh out of the box and looking beautiful. Obviously, the most pristine that I have as far as these raptors go would be this one here. And again, as I had stated, this raptor released in 1993 and was released basically right before Jurassic Park. And that may have been one of the reasons why they had released the raptor at that time, I'm not too sure, but obviously we have the more scaly version of a raptor as opposed to a feathered version. We have had feathered raptors in the Safari LTD line since this point, but again, when it comes to an old school version of a Velociraptor, it really doesn't get cooler or, in my opinion, more iconic than this one. Now, obviously, you can see we've got a really cool color scheme for it, and that was another one of the things that I think really drew me to this figure at the time, was how neat looking the color scheme is. It's very flashy, and I almost feel like it may have had, I doubt it, but may have had some influence or inspiration on the color scheme for the Lost World Jurassic Park Velociraptors, because it almost has that tiger stripe kind of look to it. Now, this figure was actually sculpted by Greg Wenzel, if you are familiar with him. I have definitely heard his name many times in the dinosaur collecting community, and it's basically around 1/6 scale, very similar in size to the beasts of the Mesozoic raptors. If you have any of those in your collection, that should give you a pretty good idea as far as the size goes. But what is cool about this is, considering this is a hand-painted figure, you often get different looking versions. And I don't know for sure if these are straight up different repaints, but you can see very different coloration on both, and the patterning is a little bit different on this one. Obviously, some of the paint is kind of worn away on this, but it's more of a yellowish tone, whereas this one's more of an orangish tone. And you can see basically that this orange moving over the back is a lot more intense on this one, a lot less intense on this one. So again, I don't know if this is just a matter of it being slightly different because they're all hand painted, or if there were actually different variants at one point when it comes to this type of color scheme, because you can very clearly see a bit of difference. However, the overall figure is very similar, so I don't feel like we actually need to go over this one or anything. It's just that you can very clearly see that the colors do differ slightly. So anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight to a closer look at these right now. So starting up here at the head sculpt of our Velociraptor, you can see it looks pretty cool. Definitely has some decent looking detail. Again, it's not going to be as impressive as you find nowadays from Safari LTD, but it's impressive enough. And for its time, you know, it's got some decent looking scale, detail, and skin texture. Here on the face, you can see that we have kind of like an orangish tone, kind of like a yellowish orange. It's a very interesting variation of color. And then you have these orange stripes, but there's also like some brown that's been added to them. If you move back here, you can kind of see like there's an orange striping, and then there's like a brown that kind of runs through certain areas of the striping. Same deal here that you can see on the lower jaw. You also have these interesting crests on the head of the raptor. Not something that you often see on Velociraptors nowadays, but Safari LTD took a chance on that. Again, definitely their own artistic liberties as far as that goes, because I don't ever recall anybody potentially stating raptors had those, so pretty interesting that they added that on there. We also have the nostrils darkened there, again to highlight those. We can see the eyes are painted with a white, then there's like a orange and then a black pupil, and they look okay. They're definitely not the best as far as the paintwork goes, but they're not too terrible. You have a light tone there for the inside of the mouth. We can see the tongue sticking up, and of course the teeth are all sculpted pretty nicely. They kind of look like they're actually, for the most part, sculpted together. They don't appear to be sculpted individually or anything like that. Yeah, and you can see the paintwork is definitely a bit sloppy overall, which isn't a great thing, but I would say Safari LTD, even though they are as iconic as it gets, didn't have the best paintwork back in this period. Although, I will also say that the paintwork of this, once you leave the mouth and the eyes, because the eyes aren't perfect, the paintwork is pretty impressive just because there is so much patterning moving through. But as you lead down here into the neck, you still see that patterning again with the striping effect. It's pretty vibrant right here. It becomes a little bit more subtle down here. Definitely a bit darker up here. We have some nice skin wrinkles and stuff. You can see the throat here on the underside of the dinosaur moving down. You can kind of make out the shoulder blade a little bit as well. As you lead down into the arms, the muscle definition is definitely there. We still have some of that striping, but it's again very, very subtle, very lightly applied. You have some of that orangish tone out here. Kind of looks like it's been applied with like a wash. I'm trying to decipher if it's a wash or a dry brushing. The hands are definitely iffy, that's for sure. They look very strange. The fingers are like bent in strange positions. The nails look pretty ugly. And same deal for this hand over here. The fingers are just so thick and awkward looking. That is one area I've never been a big fan of as far as this figure goes, would be the hands. But at least they're not pronated, so I guess that's a plus. But you can see again the same type of paintwork and everything over there. Just kind of a jumbled, sloppy mess as far as the hands go. As you move back up into the stomach, you can see again the skin detail does look quite nice. We have more of those stripes moving down through the course of the body. I love that on this one we have that orangish brown sort of tone running over the top, and the stripes kind of seem to lead out of that. We also have a row of scoots, basically a row of like ridges moving along the spinal column, painted with a black. Not the best paintwork in that area as well, kind of a little bit thick and overbearing, I would say. They didn't quite, capture just those ridges. They basically just painted a line over the top of the dinosaur. As you lead back into the thigh, you can see more of that striping effect, more really nice skin detail, muscle definition, everything like that. You've got the knee there in the front, the calf as you move down. And then as you move down into the foot, again, the foot, it doesn't look that great. Similar to the hands, it looks a little bit off, I would say, but considering the time that this figure was made, I guess it's a bit excusable. It's not quite the quality that we see from Safari LTD nowadays, but the nails are painted, and they even have a little bit of a glossy look to the nails, which is something that I don't really remember seeing too often back in this period of time. And then as you move up into the tail, you have a really nice long tail with a very interesting curve heading downward, and we have those stripes again leading out through the course of the entire tail, and it looks super flashy, super cool. One of the reasons why I think this figure stood out in my mind for so long was the very cool, unique look to it, but also the striking paint scheme. And of course, you're going to see pretty much the same thing over here. The head is turned toward the dinosaur's left. You can see that, so the head's kind of facing away from us now. You can see a bit of the stretching here in the neck. Again, the skin texture looks pretty nice. We do have that very awkward, very large hand for our Velociraptor over here. Again, you can see the detail continues to look, again, pretty darn impressive for the time that this figure was made. The paintwork as well is really smooth for the most part, at least as far as the striping and patterning. It's quite smooth. Again, the somewhat awkward looking foot sculpt, pretty sloppy paintwork for the nails, though. You can see it's definitely not hit its mark perfectly right there. And then you again lead out here into the tail with the very cool striping as you move along. And you can also see the detailing on the underside looks quite nice. So this is the main release of the Velociraptor. Again, as I said, sometimes you see variations of the Raptor where the paint differs a bit. As you can see, this one again is a lot lighter in coloration, and the striping isn't exactly the same. It's a bit darker and more obvious as you look at this one. Even the designing of the striping moving down the thigh is different compared to this one, and the striping moving out into the tail is kind of similar for the most part. When we look over here again, you can kind of see like the basic gist of the way that the paint works, but again, I don't know if that is a different variant released at a later date or if that was just a an issue with it being a hand-painted figure. You never know if they might differ from each other. But then, as I said, there was a different variant that came out at a later date, and this one sports a very cool brownish color scheme, and I always feel like the other one makes a very nice male. This one makes a very nice female, and you can see they've added some beautiful browns to this one with a nice dark wash, which helps to highlight the detail. Pretty much the same paintwork for the inside of the mouth and everything. The eye, though, has less variation of color, as we have an orange that overtakes the entire eye and a black slit-like pupil. You have a darker tone there around the eye socket, and as you move down you can see a striping effect that moves through the body. This one I feel like was heavily influenced from Jurassic Park because it has kind of the same style of color, same style of paintwork that you sort of see on Jurassic Park Velociraptors. So in my opinion, I feel like this might have been an attempt on the part of Safari LTD to kind of cash in on Jurassic Park, which kind of is a little different than what you usually see from them. They usually don't go so much off of pop culture outside of Dino Dana and Dino Dan, but they often, have their own individuality, basing their figures more off of scientific accuracy and their own unique appearance, whereas obviously, in my opinion anyway, this one has a influence from Jurassic Park. You can see again, the paintwork is pretty steady through the course of the body, where we basically just have the brown, the dark wash, and the striping moving through. You can see some light grays have been added to the underside of the figure, and in general the entire underbelly sports a grayish tone. And I do like the way that the paint has been added to this one. I think it looks very natural, very realistic, and again, absolutely makes a beautiful female variant for this Velociraptor. And you can see both sides again look really quite nice when it comes to the paint. I would say even though the other paint scheme is flashier, the paint looks more consistent on this release. And as I mentioned, you can still purchase this one from Dejankins.com, which if you are interested, I would highly recommend grabbing it from there, because it's not one that I encounter often. If you even go searching for it on eBay, I feel like you'll have a hard time trying to find one. So definitely a really cool version. And then of course you also have the glow-in-the-dark version. This one is basically the same sculpt, but just you've got an orange moving along the back, and then you have kind of like a lighter orangish or yellowish tone for the underside of the raptor. And that's really it outside of the eye paint. The eye paint does feature a dark tone that sort of borders around the eye and then a black pupil, and that's really about it. You know, you're not going to have much in the way of color on something like this, but this was always a really cool release, if you ask me. One that I felt like was really fun just because it's basically like a throwback to those old school glow-in-the-dark dinosaur toys that I'm sure if you're my age, many of us probably had. I know I certainly did. And also, again, the type of figure that inspired the glow-in-the-dark Beasts of the Mesozoic figures. So very cool to see this one kind of sitting in that same area of influence that the Beasts of the Mesozoic figures have, where obviously it's influenced from those older glow-in-the-dark figures. But it is a really cool version, and it's just neat to be able to have all the different variants of this raptor. Now, of course, all of these raptors share the same sculpt, so you're not going to find any difference in size from one to the other, which means we only need to measure one. Lengthwise, you are looking at about 11 inches, almost on the dot, or around 28 centimeters. And the highest point would definitely be the tail. You are looking at a little under 4 3/4 inches, or just shy of 12 centimeters. For a size comparison, there is Mr. Papo T-Rex, the Attack Pack Colovosaurus, Robert Muldoon, and the Collect A Human Being, kind of sitting in a sea of velociraptors here. And you can see again, the raptor does sport a pretty darn good size. Very impressive for Safari LTD, especially being a velociraptor. You don't see velociraptors from them in this size range very often. And just in case you happen to have this was another version of the scaly raptor from Safari LTD. But you can see again, when it comes to the scaly versions of the Velociraptor, the size difference is quite impressive on the older version, again, originally released in 1993. And then we have a size comparison with a Mattel Velociraptor as well. I don't feel like we need too many comparisons this time around. Again, it is a figure that is pretty popular. It's one that many people have either in their collection or have at least seen. And again, it's also very similar in size to the Beasts of the Mesozoic Raptors, as I had said earlier. Again, sitting pretty much right there in like that 1/6 scale range. So I don't feel like we need too many more comparisons. As I said before, this Velociraptor is iconic, if you ask me. Again, at least as far as I'm concerned, it is one of those figures that absolutely got me into collecting. It's that one figure that was like in the back of my mind growing up. Before I really started getting serious into collecting dinosaurs, it was just that one dinosaur that I almost had flashbacks of at times over the years, because I just was so much of a big fan of this when I had seen it as a child. I wanted it so badly and did not get it at that time. So when I eventually did, it was a pretty nice, overwhelming feeling to be able to finally get one into my collection. And now I have tons, and obviously, as you can see, all of the different variants of it, as far as I'm aware, as well. But the sculpt, again, for the time was just so unique. It was so cool looking, and pretty much was, in my opinion, a perfect representation of how we viewed Velociraptor at this time. You know, whenever I would see the dinosaur in any sort of a book or a magazine or anything, it was very often portrayed looking similar to this. Maybe not exactly the same coloration and stuff, but it just in general looked so cool that it was a very memorable figure that stuck in my mind for years. And I can see why still now, as an adult collector, years later, having so many figures of a way higher quality, I feel like this Velociraptor still stands out in one of the best ways possible. The sculpt, of course, isn't incredible, especially when you look at the hands and feet, but it just overall is a very cool looking version of a Velociraptor. And of course, one of the biggest aspects that I think sells this figure for me is the incredibly striking paint scheme. And obviously we have different versions of that paint scheme, even including that glow-in-the-dark version, but it is still a very flashy paint scheme that I think looks excellent. It was extremely striking at the time, but at the same time very natural, if you ask me. And this was right around the time where I think we were starting to kind of like jump into the idea of dinosaurs being fairly colorful, so it was so cool to see a raptor or a dinosaur in general that looked as striking as this one does. So as a whole, this is again a figure that is very near and dear to my heart. Even though it's clearly not the greatest Velociraptor we've ever seen, it is one of the most striking and probably one of the most nostalgic Velociraptors, and in my opinion one of the most iconic overall. So if you are interested, I will try to find some links to include to you guys in the description down below where you can purchase all of these. I don't know for sure if I'll find that glow-in-the-dark variant, but I'll give it a shot. We'll see what happens. So again, make sure you check those links, grab these if you are interested, and like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next review. Thanks for watching.